fucking internet. I don't know why it doesn't work. Dun, dun, dun. All right. Good morning, everyone. We're waiting for a few people to sign in, and we will get started in about 1 minute. Thank you. Welcome, and thank you for joining our Home-Based Advocacy, How to Educate and Advocate Virtually webinar. I would first like to thank our sponsors, JPMorgan Chase and Wells Fargo, for their support. I am Marquita Robertson, Executive Director of the Collaborative, and the Collaborative's mission is to close the wealth gap in North Carolina by ensuring that everyone has a pathway to prosperity. We have a few housekeeping announcements before we get started. The webinar is being recorded and can be accessed on our website later this week. This is a group discussion. However, all webinar attendees are muted at the start to ensure sound quality. Please share your comments or ask questions by using the Q&A feature you see at the bottom of your screen. We want to maximize your experience with this webinar. So you don't need to be an expert. We're all here to learn. We welcome your questions and your insights. Please get comfortable and engage with us. And throughout the program, identifies ways that you can integrate some of the tools and resources into your own work. The agenda. Our program will start with some context around virtual advocacy and quickly move into our panel discussion. Then we'll have questions from our audience. Today's discussion. COVID-19 has impacted us and our work in so many ways. It's highlighted the value of our work and the importance of our fight, which makes this webinar more timely and more critical than ever. But just how do we educate on the issues while social distancing and working from home? Advocacy efforts don't have to be interrupted or slowed down due to social distancing. The same tools that we used pre-COVID-19, aside from in-person meetings, are still available now. With more policymakers utilizing social media and leaning on email to interact with constituents, connecting them with them now may be a lot simpler than you think. Today, we're going to hear from two North Carolina legislative experts who will share insights on how to engage policymakers during this time and leave with the Collaborative's Advocacy Toolkit and other ideas to inform your advocacy strategy. Also, based off the feedback provided during the registration, we'll speak on affordable housing and the HEROES Act. So now let's move into our panel discussion. Our panelists are very familiar with our work and our issues and work daily for causes that are critical to all of us on this call. Like all of us, their work has been greatly impacted by social distancing, and we'll have a chance to hear how they have leveraged tools and practices used before COVID-19 to advocate virtually now. We'll kick it off with an introduction from Tiffany Gladney. Tiffany, can you share a little bit about your work and yourself?
Sure. So good morning, everybody. I'm Tiffany Gladney, and my current role is policy manager at the North Carolina Rural Center. We are an economic development nonprofit that focuses on increasing access to quality, affordable healthcare and high-speed broadband and things of that nature for rural communities. Out of the 100 counties in North Carolina, 80 are rural, and we seek to serve all of them. So I always tell people policy manager is just a polite way of saying lobbyist. So I am down there on Jones Street as much as possible. Of course, now with COVID-19, that has changed drastically, which we'll get into a little later. So thanks for having me, guys.
Thank you, Tiffany. And Rochelle, can you tell us a little about yourself and your work?
Yes, thank you all so much for having me today, and good morning, everyone. My name is Rochelle, and I work at the Center for Responsible Lending as their Director of North Carolina Policy. Like Tiffany, in a more normal year, I would be spending a great deal of my time right now in Raleigh, but with COVID-19, our work to advance a fair and accessible marketplace for all people, financial marketplace for all people, has shifted. The Center for Responsible Lending is particularly focused on people of color, women, and rural residents, both here in North Carolina, and actually we work across the country and in Washington, D.C. on the federal level as well, to try and help folks who are underserved in the current financial marketplace and people who are more likely to be targeted by unfair or abusive financial products. And so we are here to talk housing, lending, and also I'm really looking forward to sharing with you what we've been figuring out over the past couple of months about how to get to legislators and have them hear from us in a time when we can't wait outside the bathroom for them. Ooh, Marquita, you're still muted.
Oops, I was muted, sorry. Yes. Thank you, Rochelle, and thank you, Tiffany. What a wealth of experience you bring to this conversation. We're so happy to have you on the call. So we'll start with Tiffany. Most of the material that we're going to cover today is intended to be implemented virtually, but the same techniques would apply for an in-person visits pre-COVID. We know that a lot has changed in terms of engaging elected officials because of social distancing, but what are some of the things that have remained the same and can still be executed virtually?
Yeah, sorry about that. Couldn't get off of mute. So I think at the heart of advocacy is your why. So that remains the same whether you are virtual or in person. Why does this issue matter to you? Why do you care about it? How does it impact your life? How will it impact these identified legislators' constituents? How will it impact them? How do we make it an issue that will resonate with them? So I think that has remained the same, as well as relationships, and really harnessing relationships, not only with legislators, but always working in coalition. So Rochelle and I have worked together for many, many years in coalition because of our organizations, but also Rochelle might be next door neighbors with the Senate Majority Leader that I need for my broadband bill. So it's about that coalition and building and maintaining those relationships.
Thank you. And, you know, relationships is something that we'll talk a lot about throughout this call, and really an important factor when we talk about building relationships with policymakers. So to get a better understanding of our audience's engagement, we're going to take a poll. So please take a moment to answer these questions on your screen. So how have you engaged with elected officials in the past? And please select all that applies to you. Email, written correspondence, placed a phone call to an official, invited an official to an event, use social media, had an in-person meeting with an official, and other. And if you have other, please feel free to put that in the chat. All right, and we can go ahead and close the poll. And it looks like 90% of our audience has emailed or written a correspondence to an elected official. So that is pretty interesting and right in line with what we had expected. Thank you for sharing, and we are very excited about that, and we're going to continue with our discussion. So, Rochelle, successful advocacy is still about relationships, as Tiffany just mentioned. And our audience seems to be pretty familiar with that. But what are some ways that even during these times that they can foster relationships with policymakers virtually?
It's a great question. And I think, as Tiffany said, relationship development is still key to advocating for any issue that anyone on this webinar cares about. And so I think being a little bit creative about how to either start a relationship or continue an existing relationship in a time when you can't physically be near each other, or it's more difficult to be physically close to each other, is sort of the key to continuing to engage in successful advocacy. And there are a bunch of ways. I mean, here we are right now on a webinar together, where typically I imagine we would have done this maybe at the rural center in a different time. And so you can pull people together, you can have a meeting, you can continue to foster relationships with folks using technology for sure. And all of the things that you might think of from that poll are adaptable to the current situation, I think. I mean, obviously, making a phone call, sending an email, none of that has really changed at all, other than the messaging, right? I think a lot of the work that we all do right now is affected by COVID-19 and the direct line between either the health impacts for people, the disparate impact on different communities, including communities of color, of COVID-19, and then the economic fallout, which is going to cause all kinds of havoc for small business, is already causing havoc for small business, for people who need to pay their rent or their mortgages, for people who are in need of food. And it's just laying bare, and I know we've had a lot of questions too about rural broadband, as students are trying to do schoolwork from home and their parents maybe are trying to do what we're doing right now and meet remotely. That if you have those tools, internet access can help you to maintain relationships. You can listen in on hearings at the General Assembly so that you know what's going on and what people are saying, even if you're not able to be or are not comfortable being in the room. You can invite people to events, legislators to events, or other policymakers, doesn't have to be legislators. If you're hosting a webinar like this, letting your legislator know that it's happening and inviting them to attend, whether they come or not, keeps you on their radar. So I think that, leveraging technology and also going back to some basics that I think we sometimes overlook in favor of that sort of physical face-to-face meeting now become more relevant again. And that may be writing a letter to the editor of your newspaper, working with a local editorial board over the phone to help them to understand an issue, bring it to their attention. There's lots of ways that we can still both make our issue heard and expand upon or build a new relationship with legislators.
Thank you, Rochelle. That's interesting. Thank you for sharing that. So with the help of our friends at Prosperity Now, your organization, the Center for Responsible Lending, and Tiffany's organization, the North Carolina Rural Center, the collaborative has developed an advocacy toolkit that we'll be sharing with all of our attendees at the end of the webinar to support both virtual and in-person advocacy efforts. Can you walk us through these tools and how folks on the call can leverage these tools during social distancing?
Yeah, absolutely. This is a terrific toolkit that y'all have put together, Marquita, and it's really exciting for me to take a look at it and to be on this webinar sharing these resources with the folks who are attending today. The toolkit includes some examples of advocacy, right? Tiffany and I think largely engage in lobbying as our form of advocacy, but that is far from the only way that you can be an advocate for a particular issue. In addition to trying to convince legislators or other policymakers to do something that you want them to do, other examples of advocacy include education, either for community or for lawmakers, letting them know what's happening. And so there's a terrific list of ways in which you can engage in advocacy, even if lobbying isn't the right fit for you, or you're not allowed to engage in lobbying very much because you work at a nonprofit organization. There are some other examples in here, and I leave it to you all to take a look at those, but just be aware that there's definitely more than one way to do advocacy work. There's also some information in here about how to prepare for a call with your legislator. And I can't emphasize that enough. I think sometimes I get really excited about an issue and I really want to talk to somebody about it. And you just get on the phone and someone answers and all of a sudden you're like, I don't know what I want to say. So this particular handout describes for you how to get ready and includes things like reminding you to say hello and reminding you to thank the person that takes your call at the end. Because sometimes maybe I get nervous. And so just having this great outline of how to introduce yourself, how to frame the issue that you're calling about. Particularly paying attention to the storytelling piece of it. Why is this important to you? Right? You don't just, you can certainly just call and say, support House Bill 1068. I really like it too, and I'm your constituent. But it's more meaningful if you can explain a little bit why it matters to you. And so this provides you with sort of an outline of how to put that together before you make that call. And similarly, there's an outline for how to write to your legislator. So just to kind of guide you through what sorts of things you want to say and how to frame your message a little bit. And then there are a couple of handouts about storytelling itself, which fit in beautifully with this writing to your legislator or calling your legislator. How to put together that story, how to think about messaging. It's sometimes hard, I think, and feels a little bit forced to think in advance about how you want to frame a particular issue or a particular story, but it's really meaningful, right? Tiffany was talking about what if Rochelle lives next door to the Senate Majority Leader that I need for my particular bill? Can I use that relationship to get in with that person? And that's, I don't think anybody really thinks of it as being using people. This is how we get our stuff done, is by figuring out who we know, why they care about it, and explaining to them why we care about it in a way that's going to hit them where it matters, right in their heart or right in their brain. And so being thoughtful about how you talk about the issue that you care about and how to talk about it in the way that's going to have the most impact means that you're more likely to change people's lives for the better. So I do strongly encourage you to take a look at these terrific storytelling for advocacy handouts. I think that I really like looking at them in advance of the webinar. And so I think that they are really helpful tools. In addition to that, there are a couple more handouts. One of them is about getting an op-ed published. And this handout also I really liked a lot. It talks kind of like we've been talking about developing a relationship with the editorial board at your local newspaper or any paper if you want to get something published in a larger statewide paper like the NNO or the Charlotte Observer. How do you do that, right? You don't just want to come at folks out of left field and say, here's this thing that I really care about, go do something about it. It can take some time to develop that relationship with the editorial board, to develop credibility, for them to hear you and really feel like what you're asking them to do is the right thing. And so I encourage you to take a look at that and think about making a phone call or an email to your ed board at your local paper, and offering them some information, introducing yourself, offering to have a phone call with them or a FaceTime call so that you can see each other, to just let them know what issue you care about and that you are looking to develop a relationship with them. And the last handout I think that you have in your advocacy toolkit is about joining together, in this case, particularly with Prosperity Now, but I want to encourage you all to think of other organizations that work in coalition across the nation or in North Carolina, in addition to Prosperity Now. Joining a coalition or national or statewide group is a terrific way for you to get information about what's happening at the General Assembly or in Congress or with any number of regulatory agencies on a whole host of issues. So one example I'll bring up again later is the North Carolina Housing Coalition, because we did have a lot of folks in the poll to register talking about how much they cared about expanding access to affordable housing. So if you want to know what's going on with affordable housing in North Carolina, the North Carolina Housing Coalition is a great place to put your email address into their website, let them email you with their updates about the legislature and about funding opportunities at the local level, so that you can keep abreast of that. So I think this is a terrific packet. So very much of it is still absolutely applicable, even in the time of COVID. Very little has changed, again, in terms of what's important here, which is your passion, your ability to articulate and tell a story about that, and your ability to get in touch with a policymaker to share your passion and your story. So with small tweaks, like using video chatting, or relying more on phone calls and texting than you would have in a normal year, everything else about how you do this work still applies.
All right, thanks, Rochelle. That you covered a lot of information, and thank you for that. And a few folks have put into the Q&A how they received the toolkit, and this toolkit will be sent to you via the email that you registered for this webinar at shortly there after the call convenes. Another question that I had, Rochelle, how can your organization, Center for Responsible Lending, support members, our members, and anyone really that's interested in joining or advocating for causes? How can Center for Responsible Lending support them during social distancing? I think your mute is on.
There we go. I have to wait for someone to give me permission to demute. Yes. So the Center for Responsible Lending has a few different ways that they can support North Carolina-based organizations during social distancing with advocacy efforts. One of them, like I was mentioning with the coalition, the Affordable Housing Coalition, is that we also run a coalition, the Coalition for Responsible Lending. And so for folks who are interested in issues around changes to interest rates, mostly federal activity at this point, around payday lending, car title lending, something called Rent-A-Bank, where banks are allowed to come in and use their out-of-state higher interest rates to make loans to North Carolinians. We send out action alerts periodically when there are actually opportunities to weigh in, either legislatively or maybe sign on to a comment. And so joining that coalition, which is, it's an extremely informal coalition. There's no membership dues. You don't have to sign away your life or anything, but you just sign up, give us your email address. We'll let you know when things are happening and what to do about them. So that's one way that we can help you figure out how to engage during a time of social distancing. And all of the recommendations that we have about actions that you can take will be ones that you can take safely from home. In addition to that, we're also working, ramping up work on student loans. And we have a terrific report on our website about the impact of student loan debt on North Carolinians. And its impact is huge. And what we've seen is that, for example, folks in North Carolina and across the country are delaying homeownership and starting families because of student loan debt, and putting their lives on hold basically in order to be able to make those payments. And so we're planning on working together. We're planning on working together with a coalition of folks in North Carolina to try and pass some legislation next year on this issue. And in order to help us do that, we're looking into doing some story gathering, and actually have some pass-through funding from Annie E. Casey Foundation. And just wanted to let you all on this call know about that in case you might want to touch base with me, so that we could talk about how your organization might be able to help be a part of that work and help us to gather stories, or if you have suggestions about how we gather those so that we can begin that push as the legislative session apparently is winding down this year already. So that's another way, is with some actual, not a huge amount, but some financial resources to join forces with us on student lending in particular. And, you know, we'd also, I would be really happy if any of y'all are interested in lending issues or financial products issues in North Carolina generally, to connect with me. We will be sort of revitalizing our Coalition for Responsible Lending over the course of the rest of this year, and would love to talk to you if you have thoughts or ideas about how best we could do that.
Thank you, Rochelle. We're going to move to Tiffany now. Earlier you spoke about some of the things that are still the same, and Rochelle just walked us through some advocacy materials that we're going to share later with our partners. But how can we continue to build partner during this time of social distancing?
Yeah, that's actually a great question. So I wrote down a little list while you guys were talking. So the first one is legislative staff. I feel like people really underestimate the person that they encounter at the front desk when you go to visit a legislator. Their legislative assistant or research assistant or associate, they really have a lot of power, a lot more power than you might realize. And if nothing else, they are the gatekeeper to the policymaker. So if you want to get on the policymaker's calendar and the legislative assistant doesn't like you, guess what? You're not getting a meeting. So really fostering those relationships with legislative staff is crucial. I've been on my soapbox, especially lately, about voting. If you notice a trend in your state or even your federal delegates, vote. If they're not putting forth policy that addresses your needs and is reflective of the community that they represent, then the biggest way to change that is to go out and vote. Numbers. So I think we've also seen in recent days when a whole bunch of people come together, it makes government move. Now, we might not agree with some of the ways in which government moves, but it makes them sit up and pay attention. And that goes directly into my last point there, which is speak up and speak out. I cannot tell you how many times I have spoken with legislators and they'll be like, oh, I've never heard of that. I didn't know that. Like, why didn't anybody tell me that? And for us that are living it, it's like, well, duh. But you really have to speak truth to power because a lot of times they really just have no idea.
Thanks, Tiffany. And you raised a good point with the LAs or the legislative assistants. I think that's a little known tidbit that a lot of folks don't know, but is very, very important to your advocacy efforts. So thanks for highlighting that. We spent some time on some tried and true advocacy tools, but how can folks connect directly with their policymakers effectively during this time?
Yeah. So I have to tell a short story. So actually my mother is a teacher and she was seeking to file unemployment after the outbreak. And she couldn't get through on the website like many people, and she couldn't get through when she called in. And so she finally called me and said, well, you know, she was just kind of complaining about it. And I said, well, call your legislators. Who's my legislators? Call them, like I can talk to them. I was like, you are the mother of a lobbyist. Like, why don't you know this? And so, of course, she got in touch with her senator's office, her respective senator's office, and they got her claim expedited, and she's getting her direct deposits now. So I tell that story to say that good old-fashioned phone calls go a long way. My mother is in her 60s, so the whole like emailing, social media thing, that's not really her zhush. But for her, she just picked up the phone the old-fashioned way and called and said hi. Of course, I gave her a script because I gave her a script. But, you know, emphasize that you are a teacher, emphasize that you are a constituent, emphasize that you are lacking whatever you're lacking, and that you sent them to Raleigh to represent you. So good old-fashioned phone calls really do go a long way. So keep that in mind. But it also goes back to the legislative assistant. 9 out of 10 times, you're not going to get the legislator directly on the phone when you call the main line. But the legislative assistant is going to be a champion for you when it comes to the policymaker. So also social media. This is something that I have done probably my entire lobbying. If I'm reaching out to a legislator and I can't get them on the phone, I can't get them an email, they won't text me back, whatever the case may be, I'm going to tweet you. And I'm going to give you some kind of statistic. You know, did you know, I'm going to make up 1 in 4 school-age children don't have access to broadband. You know, something like that. We would love to speak with Senator Johnson to learn how we could work together to ensure that every child in North Carolina has access to broadband. So it's a little bit of public shaming, which I probably shouldn't admit, kind of puts them on the spot. So then there's a little bit more accountability in the response, but also it's a good way to engage them and get on their radar, as Rochelle was talking about. And the last suggestion is live stream. Now the General Assembly has a live stream option. This is completely new. So you can literally go on and watch on YouTube live committee meetings and voting sessions for the House and the Senate. So this is really, really important because if nothing else, it shows you the dynamics. So if you're working with a staunch Republican that represents your area, but then you have a Democrat that you need to engage as well. By watching these committees, you might see that they don't like each other. So maybe you don't need to have them working on the same issue together. Or maybe they have a bromance and you do want them to work together and see if you can get an increase in appropriations or whatever the case may be.
Thank you, Tiffany. And I'll be honest, until you started talking with me about leveraging social media to reach out or to get the attention of a policymaker, I would have never in imagined years thought that to be an effective approach. So very insightful. Thank you for that. So we have another poll to get a better idea of how familiar our audience or our attendees are with their elected officials. Please take a moment to answer this yes or no question. Do you know who your local representatives are? Yes or no? So we'll go ahead and close the poll because that was a pretty quick one. Thanks for sharing. It looks like most of you, about 94% of the folks on the call, know who their local representatives are, which is awesome. So now we're continuing with that. Tiffany, it looks like most people, you know, according to the poll, are familiar with representatives. How can we leverage information from the General Assembly's recently updated website to connect with policymakers virtually?
Yes. So kind of going back to the live stream point. So, but let's backtrack for a second and look at the breakdown of the General Assembly. And this number has actually probably changed a little bit in the sense that 2020 and the end of 2019 and 2020 was an odd year in the sense that we lost a lot of legislators. passing away from sicknesses or whatever the case may be. And a few other ones were selected to sit on other commissions and had to leave the General Assembly. So this breakdown might have shifted a little bit, going out of 2019 long session and into the 2020 short session. But this right here is a really important breakdown because it shows you, if nothing else, that there is no veto-proof majority anymore. So the demographics are consistently changing, and anytime there's a veto task, they're going to have to turn somebody. So somebody's going to have to go the other way, either way. So yeah, so keep that in mind. And then of course, this will shift even more as elections continue. So next slide. Okay, so with the newly updated website, Rochelle and I often gush about this new General Assembly website because as lobbyists, the old one was horrible, okay? Horrible. So this one is way more user-friendly, way more dynamic, way more interactive. So I wanted to include this particular screenshot because this shows what I call a legislator's Facebook profile. So the General Assembly website is ncleg.com. And once you go there, you can actually select either House or Senate members. So I picked out Jimmy Dixon here because he's just such a character. So if you look here, you can see not only his headshot, but you can also see what the area he represents, and also the committees he sits on, legislative history, voting history, and even bills he's introduced. Next slide, please. So this right here, when you go to the committee and voting history, you can see here which committees he sits on. So let's say, for example, that you're really interested in farming. You'll see that Jimmy Dixon is not only a farmer, but also sits on the agriculture and natural resources committees. So, then this can be a resource that he can be a tool. He can be a champion that you can use potentially with your issue. And then it also shows you engagement. Then you can go and tune into these committee meetings and see how he votes and the public comments that he might make and the debate that might ensue during some of these committee meetings. And then you can also go to the committee webpage. So I live on the committee webpage because that's going to house your committee meeting agenda and your committee meeting, the bills they're going to discuss, even if they're in draft form, so they haven't officially been filed. It's kind of like getting a little cheat sheet, a little sneak preview of what might come out of that committee and might ultimately be filed and possibly pass into law. Get familiar with the committee members. Figure out if they're interested in transportation or health, or are they a staunch budget hawk, or are they more so interested in the human interest aspect of policy making? So keep that in mind. And as I talked about earlier, observe interactions. Who's kind of snippy with each other and who's really chummy, because then you'll know how you can leverage those potential relationships and possibly have multiple champions, which idealistically you of course want a champion in both chambers, and a champion with a little bit of political power and political sway. Next slide, please. So how to listen in and now watch, because the website has indeed changed in response to COVID. So let's say you can't make it to Raleigh, or you don't want to make it to Raleigh, or you don't want to get out of bed, but you want to know what they're talking about today. Or if you're like me, literally this morning I was listening to a committee meeting and then got off that committee meeting to join you guys. So, and I am right here at home. So you can listen in. You can also watch to view the committee committee's meeting schedule, you can of course reference the legislative calendar, which is highlighted on the screen right now. And that'll show you exactly which committees are meeting that day. And if you expand the calendar, it will show you which bills they'll be discussing. So next slide, please. So the committee meeting list, this will tell you, or the committee meeting pages. So this is a good way to figure out where your priorities match up and align with the standing committees that are currently in place. So if you're trying to legalize marijuana, let's say, you might want to go through the agriculture committee and then also go through health committee and then go through appropriations if you would like for some money to be infused into whatever your plan may be. So this is a really good tool to see, if nothing else, where the legislature's mind is and what they think are important. So going back to speaking truth to power, you know, a COVID-19 House Select Committee was created because obviously we're all living in these really unprecedented times. So they created a committee based off of the needs of their constituents. So keep that in mind. And then committee composition. How many of you know someone who's on the committee? You know, maybe, and how many Republicans sit on the committee versus Democrat? How many females sit on the committee? How many African Americans or Latinx or Asian folks are on the committee as well? So keep that in mind because that can also be very useful in really unconventional ways as well.
Thanks, Tiffany. And so before we go on, I have a quick question. So you mentioned, you know, keep tabs on who's snappy or how they interact with each other. How might someone that is on our call, how might they do that?
Well, at the General Assembly, it's pretty obvious. You'll know who's snippy and who's not. They're not very discreet about it, but I will also, a caveat to that is never go to a legislator and talk about another legislator. It doesn't matter if it's a Democrat or a Republican. Never do that. I heard a legislator once say, he's like, if you'll talk about a legislator with me, you'll talk about me. And I was like, whoa, that's huge. So it doesn't mean you say, yeah, I noticed that Senator Jackson had an attitude with you today. I can't stand Senator Jackson. No. You can acknowledge it. You know, I noticed that there was a little bit of banter going on between you and Senator Jackson, and I wanted to figure out how I could best support you in moving this bill forward. How can we work with Senator Jackson to ally their concerns, but also bring them in as a possible champion? Now, you might be thinking Senator Jackson's a butthead or whatever, but you don't say that to the actual legislator. So I hope that answers the question.
No, that makes perfect sense. And I'm also wondering, how can you glean some of the insights or informations that you would usually get from a General Assembly visit using the online YouTube videos? Like, is that a way to kind of get a read on the room to see how people feel about things? Like, what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, it is. I mean, of course, the camera angles are limited. You know, I think I had the unrealistic expectation that it was going to be like a TV show and they were going to cut to this person and zoom in on that person. No. It's not like that. It's a static camera with one angle and one angle only, you know, so it can be a little challenging. And I think, you know, I think it's fair to say that even, you know, me and Rochelle are trying to adjust to this new normal of virtual lobbying. So much of lobbying is about building those relationships and building that rapport and just kind of hanging out with legislators and getting to know them and getting to know what makes them tick. And that obviously is very challenging right now because I'm not going down to the General Assembly right now. So it's hard for me to run into a legislator in the snack bar and make small talk about rural North Carolina wine or something. So this is something that we're building this airplane as we're flying in it right now because virtual lobbying lobbying wasn't really set up to be virtual, so we're all trying to adapt.
No, that makes perfect sense. Thank you so much for that very candid insight, Tiffany. What are some general lobbying tips that applied before social distancing and also hold true now during social distancing?
Yeah, know your audience is the first one. Are you talking to someone who is a staunch budget hawk? You know, I've gone into meetings before and said, you know, 1 in 4 babies, and they're like, okay, cool. How much is this going to cost me? That wasn't how I got to them. The human interest, the human suffering piece. It was, this is going to cost the state $2.4 billion if we don't screen, preventative care versus treatment after the fact and diagnosis and maintenance. So it's knowing your audience, knowing where you connect. Same alma mater, same hometown. Do you both like hiking or cycling or, whatever the case may be? And figuring out what their priorities are legislatively. So going back to voting history and seeing how did they vote on Medicaid expansion or legalizing marijuana or whatever the case may be, because that will give you a lot of insight into how they think and where they stand on issues, which goes into do your research. In order to know your audience, you really have to do a little bit of digging. So not just voting history and what committees they sit on, but even scour the web and see recent media appearances they've made, or check out their social media and see what they're posting. Have they pinned any op-eds? What public stances and statements have they made recently? Be clear and honest and concise. I think it's pretty clear that I am almost honest to a fault, but it's okay when you're talking to a legislator to say, you know what, that's a really good question and I don't know the answer to it, but let me do a little research and I'll follow up with you. But then the key there is actually following up, because that builds trust and that gives you another opportunity to interact and speak with that legislator. So then you can throw in whatever your other priority might be there. So, and nobody wants to hear a long story. Keep it short. Why are you here? Why should I care about it? Why do you care about it? Know all sides of the argument. I cannot tell you how many times I've been in one-on-one meetings with legislators and they'll say, well, have you spoken to the opposing organization? No. Okay, well, you need to go talk to them. Don't talk to me, talk to them and come up with a compromise first. And a lot of times, they're just curious and want to know the entire argument. Why would I stick my neck out for this priority if I don't even know what the possible ramifications could be on the back end? So, and like I said, follow up. Make sure that you follow up, even if you can answer all the questions that the legislator might pose. It is really, really important to always lead and close with gratitude. It's a personal philosophy of mine, but also, every email, every meeting, every text message even, I close out with thank you for your service to the state. I might personally disagree with every piece of legislation they've put forth since they set foot on Jones Street, but it's still thank you for your service. Thank you for your sacrifice. Because at the end of the day, maybe it's Pollyanna-ish, but I like to think that they all think they're doing the right thing and the best thing for North Carolina. So always lead and close with gratitude. It really gets you in some doors that would otherwise be closed.
Thanks, Tiffany. I'm going to move to Rochelle. Rochelle, how can we use social media to influence policymakers during this time? I know we talked a little bit, Tiffany discussed it a little earlier, how it's pretty effective, but what can we do?
Yeah, so I've shared with y'all for today this screenshot of a Facebook ad that an organization that the Center for Responsible Lending works with up in Maine. They were doing some work around student lending as well and decided that they were going to try and collect stories about student loan borrowers' experiences with their lenders and their servicers. And this is the ad that they used. And when you clicked on it, you would be taken to a form basically where you could fill out your story. and indicate whether you were willing to have that story shared with your name, without your name, if we could follow up, or the Maine Center for Economic Policy could follow up with questions to build that out. And it was a great way to build sort of a grassroots story bank for legislators about what was happening in their own communities to people who either lived there now or who had chosen to move away because they couldn't find work that would enable them to pay their student loan debt. And it was a surprising number of folks who had moved away, actually outside of Maine for the most part, in order to just be able to make ends meet with the student loan burden that they were carrying. And so that was a really compelling argument in Maine, who, you know, they want to keep their residents, and hearing that student loan debt was keeping their residents from being able to stay home and, you know, use their education to contribute to their communities. It helped to press them to pass some legislation to protect student loan borrowers from bad servicing. And so I use this as an example for you all. You know, using Facebook ads or Instagram ads for policy issues is possible. It's inexpensive. It does take some hoop jumping in order to be able to purchase ads that are on social issues. That's what Facebook calls it, and they own Instagram. So Facebook and Instagram. You have to associate your basically your website, or not your website, your Facebook page or your Instagram page with a specific person. And so you have to send them a copy of your driver's license, or a person on your staff's driver's license, basically, to get authorized to buy ads that are related to social issues. And so you don't want to be doing this at the last minute, which is one of the reasons why I bring it up here. Is like, if you think someday maybe you might want to spend $15 or $25 on a Facebook ad or an Instagram ad, get set up to do it now. And they'll send you in the mail a secret code that you will have to then input into your Facebook page, your organizational Facebook page, to prove that the person with the driver's license also has access to the page. And once you do that, you will then be able to post ads. They still review them for content to make sure that they're acceptable and meet their community standards. But it's a terrific way for very, very low budget. I mean, if you're willing to spend $100 on a Facebook or an Instagram ad, you can reach a lot of people. I mean, you can see here in Maine, which is a much smaller state than North Carolina, that this ad, which I think got boosted with $50, got shared 222 times, 131 people commented on it, and they gathered a lot of stories from it. So they got a lot out of a pretty small investment. And so I would encourage you to, if there's any chance that your organization would ever want to do some sort of policy related ad, that you just get that set up now, so that you're not waiting 10 days or more sometimes to get the okay from Facebook to do it. I also wanted to talk a little bit about Twitter, because they have an advertising policy that prohibits political ads, including ads that take a position on policy issues. So they can be nonpartisan, they still won't let you pay for an ad. So you have to earn your reach there. And that's why a number of organizations do things like Twitter storms, where you set a hashtag and email everyone you can think of, or call everyone you can think of, and ask them to share your post using a hashtag. And so a great way for you to engage in advocacy remotely right now is to participate in usually a national organization's Twitter storm. They have to be pretty big in order to kind of break through. But there are lots of works doing that. And so I encourage you to consider that.
Thank you for that, Rochelle. And so we are going to move to our Q&A segment. If you have some questions, please send them through the Q&A. And I have some questions that were submitted via the registration that I'm going to go ahead and walk through now. Some of our attendees shared their policy interest during the registration and are interested in how to address issues with affordable housing. So I'm going to, pick a random city, let's say Albemarle, North Carolina. How can someone there engage a policymaker on affordable housing?
Well, I think the first thing is to look at current policy. So there's actually a lot of affordable housing bills moving this session. mainly one that would put $20 million into the Housing Finance Agency's Affordable Housing Workforce Program. So looking into what's already on the docket, but then also identifying where there are some gaps. So the Rural Center, we're working directly with Representative Yvonne Hawley and John Autry and some other legislators on the Senate side, because we understand that affordable housing in rural North Carolina looks completely different than affordable housing in an urban or a suburban area. So how can we come up with some comprehensive policy for all parties involved?
Thanks, Tiffany. So are there any suggestions for people advocating for people living with disabilities? Specifically, we got some questions on camps for high school students living with disabilities. Got some questions for more wheelchair accessible housing for people living with disabilities that really ties into that affordable housing piece.
Yeah, I think that's a very specific question, and neither Tiffany nor I right now are doing disability work, so I don't have sort of specific bills or legislative champions that come to mind just because I don't work in that area. But I think a lot of folks to get meetings, again, whether it's a phone call or a webinar or a video chat of some kind, to talk with folks either at your public housing authority in your local community. If we're still specifically talking about Stanley County, like call the public housing authority there and say, like, this is the issue that we're facing, is that it's hard to find accessible housing for disabled people. In particular, here's a story about someone who needed a wheelchair ramp, or here's a story about someone who needed a first floor apartment and wasn't able to find appropriate housing. Here are some suggestions. Do your research, as Tiffany said. Like, what are other communities doing? Are there church groups that are building ramps for folks that you could help connect with? Sometimes the answers are policy, and sometimes the answers are, knowing what resources are available in your community and leveraging those. And sometimes it's both together, right? Like, does that church group, would they be willing to associate with some effort by the public housing authority that's broader, and that way access funding? Obviously, giving money to the church group to build ramps might run into some problems for separation of church and state reasons, but there are totally ways to get all the stakeholders together on a Zoom call or a conference call and talk it out. Like, what can we do working together to resolve some of these problems? And in the same way, if we need in that community or any community more camp opportunities for disabled teens, what do we mean? Is it physical disabilities? Is it emotional or developmental disabilities? All of the above. Do some story gathering. It sounds like you probably already know people who are affected. Can you go to your local Parks and Rec department and start having conversations with them about the unmet need in your community? Are there funding sources? Are there barriers at the state level to accomplishing what you want to accomplish? Like, figure out who has the authority to spend money and who might be blocking spending money. And then you know what you need to do. You know who you need to reach in order to make change. And it all starts with getting on the phone, talking to people, being prepared with stories, with an explanation of the need, and being really clear about your asks.
Thank you panel audience for those questions, and thank you to everyone on the call, and a special thank you to our esteemed panelists, Tiffany Gladney and Rochelle Sparko. Following this call, you will all be emailed a post-webinar survey. Please take a moment to complete it as we tailor our offerings to serve you better. The Advocacy Toolkit referenced during the webinar will be emailed to you following. Our next webinar will be June 16th. It'll be capacity building for asset builders work and utilizing an AmeriCorps Vista to build capacity within your program, followed by virtual meetings that work, connecting with those we serve through technology. And we are partnering with a communication firm that's going to walk us through some best practices for video conferences. The central point raised during our conversation today is that social distancing does not have to stop or be complicated, does not have to stop or complicate your advocacy work. The tools that we have all been very familiar with over the past few months can be your key to starting or nurturing a relationship with your policy. Your homework is to identify one activity discussed today to connect with your policymakers and to set an implement date. And to your clients, your community, and your state needs your voice now more than ever. Thank you all for joining this webinar and have a great day.